Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the news that Boris Johnson is preparing legislation to allow ministers to suspend parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol that they don't like, and to wonder if Johnson is actually serious this time, or is he just using it to kick the can down the road a bit further and keep hardline Brexiteers off his back. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, Boris Johnson and various ministers have, at various times, threatened to suspend parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Technically, we already have in a few areas, but the EU have judged that to be not serious enough to make a massive fuss of it yet. They did initiate legal action, but they paused it to allow negotiations to continue without the shadow of legal proceedings muddying the waters. But for the best part of a year now, the UK government keep threatening to what they call trigger Article 16. Of course, what they propose has got nothing to do with Article 16. Article 16 doesn't let you suspend parts of the protocol at all. And if you can't be bothered to read it for yourself, the proof of that is in this latest news that Boris Johnson's government are preparing primary legislation to allow UK ministers to unilaterally suspend parts of the protocol. Because you think to yourself, hang on a minute, if Article 16 gives the government the rights to do this, as they have been insisting since last June, why do they now need extra legislation to do it? Because every time the issues come up in Parliament or someone's asked them in an interview, they go, oh yeah, we already have the right to trigger Article 16, and triggering Article 16 does this, this and this. It's like, so what's this about then? Why do you now need extra legislation to do what you said you could already do? It's almost like what they've been saying hasn't been entirely true. Still, as we've clearly passed the point where anyone is going to try and claim that Boris Johnson is honest, never mind that now. Now, the reported reason for this legislation is partly fear of what happens if the DUP refuse to take their seats in Stormont after the election in a couple of weeks. Now, putting to one side the illegal nature of this plan, I don't see how that makes sense. Like, sure enough, if Sinn Féin become the largest party in Stormont, as polls may suggest, after the elections, the DUP may well not take up their seats. Can absolutely believe that. That means the Assembly can't form. I mean, I know Stormont had to be set up differently to other legislative assemblies, but this idea of the entire thing collapsing because one side sulks just seems to be a bit of a weakness to me. But anyway, the idea, I think, is to use this legislation to placate the DUP. You know, if you take your seats, we will legislate to be able to suspend contentious parts of the protocol. That should keep you happy, which is pretty much, you know, all there is to it. But the thing is, you think to yourself, well, hang on a minute, how does that make sense? Because if Boris Johnson does that, isn't there a risk that, okay, the DUP may take their seats, but then Sinn Féin won't? And you still have no operational assembly. But moving on from that, what would be the consequences? Well, the first thing to go through would be the procedure, really. Because this would need primary legislation, which means it needs to pass through Parliament. That's the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Maybe it would pass through the House of Commons. It would be nice to think that enough Tory MPs would be concerned about the reputational damage to the UK of not abiding by an international treaty that we only recently signed, and that they all won a general election on a promise to implement, and they all voted for in Parliament. Indeed, there have been some Tory MPs stand up when this has been discussed in Parliament in the past and say we should not be breaking international law. But would there be enough of them who, when push comes to shove, will vote against it? I'd like to think so. My hopes, however, are not high. So assuming it passes through the Commons, which isn't a given, but is probably likely, will the House of Lords pass it? I really don't see how they can. The Lords are, of course, essentially unelected. As a result, they tend to honourably pass anything that the Commons presents to them, as long as it's in line with manifesto promises from the government. You know, such things are considered to have a mandate from the public, even if only a minority voted for it. But this is the opposite. The Northern Ireland Protocol formed part of the winning manifesto. So passing legislation that allows ministers to break international law and tear it up is the opposite of what the Lords normally do. Bear in mind that they've blocked some elements of Home Office legislation partly on the basis that it breaks international law. So they should absolutely block this on the basis that it is against international law, that it will cause the UK to suffer serious reputational damage abroad, and it will cause serious economic harm to the UK. And because it means tearing up a manifesto promise, not making good on one. And to explain that comment about serious economic harm to the UK, that would result from two things. First, if the Northern Ireland Protocol is not in place, Northern Ireland cannot safely access the single market. Now, nobody seriously believes that either side would erect physical infrastructure between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. That is what international law would require. Yeah, that is not going to happen. And that's the ace card that the Tories think they have, that the EU, the Republic of Ireland, wouldn't dare do that. But systems could still be put in place to restrict access for Northern Ireland to the single market, even if it's not going to be enforced as international law would dictate. Remember that the UK's economy has struggled compared to other advanced nations. You know, we're still behind. But if you look at individual parts, Northern Ireland recovered, just like others, from COVID because they didn't have such serious trade barriers raised against them. In fact, being the only part of Europe to be able to export goods freely to both the single market and the British market, that's a bit of a boon to them. But second, the EU could dissolve the trade and cooperation agreement that covers the rest of the UK, Britain. This threat worked on Johnson last autumn and the plan hasn't gone away. And that makes me wonder if this plan isn't just designed to ease pressure on Johnson. Right now, he's got hardline Brexiteers in his own party, and of course the DUP, haranguing him to remove the Brexit trade barriers that he said would never exist. On the other side, there's the economic and political reality of breaking international law. Economically, he will lower trade barriers in one place where there aren't that many in the first place, and they will be raised way higher everywhere else where it's much more impactful. Politically, it was difficult last year. This year, the West is trying to show a united front against Russia's war in Ukraine. Granted, it's not just the UK that's making this tricky. Germany has not been entirely helpful at times either. But the only world leader who will cheer the UK starting a trade war with the rest of Europe is Vladimir Putin. The United States has piped up again, as it did last autumn, to remind everyone that they want a negotiated settlement here, not unilateral action. So will Johnson go ahead with this or not? Well, I'll tell you what I think, and this is speculation, of course, but I am happy enough that it's probably correct. I think Johnson just wants to get rid of the swivel-eyed loons, get them off his back. He's under enough pressure right now. Last November, he threatened to just suspend parts of the protocol by citing Article 16. He didn't, when faced with international sanctions for doing so. This time, he isn't repeating the same threat. Now, instead of just saying, I'll just trigger Article 16, he's talking about using legislation to do the same thing. I think this is because he believes that the legislation will not be passed by Parliament. He can then blame unelected Lords for blocking him. Now, it is true the government could ram it through the Lords, but that takes time. Apart from anything else, it has to be done in a later session of Parliament. You can't do it in the same session. Now, we're about to end one session of Parliament and start another. And this legislation is planned for the start of the new session of Parliament. So that would mean it would have to wait until that entire session of Parliament is over and for a new one to begin, which means realistically, although there's no, prescribed length for a session in Parliament, but realistically it'd be over a year before he could force it through the Lords. Also, even if the legislation were to be passed, it doesn't mean ministers have to immediately use it. The EU and the US might step up their threats if the legislation is passed, but they wouldn't actually do anything while the protocol remains largely intact, because why would they? That's all they care about. It's only on using the legislation that anyone would act. Boris Johnson, at a time of massive pressure on his leadership, may simply be using this plan to keep the nutters off his back for a bit longer. Because they're saying, look, you promised you were going to, dissolve the Northern Ireland Protocol. You promised you had your fingers crossed behind your back, that you were only doing it to get it through Parliament, leave the EU, then you were going to tear it up. You said, why aren't you doing it? This may be his way of saying, well, here's how I'm going to do it. Always tricky to know what's going on when the lunatics are in charge of the asylum, of course. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And until next time, I'll see you later.